This is Baby Boomer Tales. Welcome to the year 2020. 100 years ago, the Roaring Twenties started. What will history call this decade? 50 years ago, the 1970s started, and a lot happened in the 1970s. So I want to give you a timeline of some of the highlights I picked out. I had to eliminate a lot of them, and I wanted to eliminate some of them. And so let's get started with this. July 4th, 1970, Casey Kasem launched the first successful national radio top 40. It's called the American Top 40, and it lasted for years and years and years. September 18th, 1970, Jimi Hendrix dies of a drug overdose. Purple Haze. October 4th, 1970, Janis Joplin dies of a drug overdose. My friends all drive Porsches. I must make amends. July 12th, 1971, All in the Family premieres on CBS. Archie, Edith, Gloria, and Meathead. March 23rd, 1971, the 26th Amendment to our Constitution is ratified. It gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. This was big and it was huge back then because 18-year-olds were old enough to go over to Vietnam and get killed but couldn't vote. July 3rd, 1971, Jim Morrison of The Doors died of unknown reasons. Jim Morrison, Light My Fire. May 2nd, 1972, J. Edgar Hoover dies. May 14th, 1973, Skylab was launched. Launched from Cape Canaveral, or Cape Kennedy, I believe it was still called then, by NASA. It had 3 missions, 3 three-man missions over the years. Its re-entry happened on July 11th, 1979. Broke apart over the ocean in a fiery ball of flames. July 17th, 1972. Several people were arrested at 2:30 a.m. at the Democrat National Committee offices in the Watergate building complex. October 1973. The Arab oil embargo began. Remember that? All of a sudden, oil raised from $3 a barrel to $12 a barrel. That means if gas was 50 cents a gallon, it was now $2 a gallon. It raised 400% almost overnight. For an example that may hit a little closer to home, yesterday I paid $2.39 a gallon when I filled up my pickup truck. That would translate to $9.56 a gallon with the oil embargo going on. I put about 22 gallons of gas in my truck, so that would have cost me $210.32. If you could even get gas, and you would probably have to wait in line for it anyway. Some of the ramifications of that affected the American people was daylight savings time started in January and not in March or April, whenever. Also, the national speed limit was lowered to 55 miles an hour. So if you've ever driven across Kansas 75 miles an hour, try to picture you doing the same thing at 55 miles an hour. There are miles and miles of nothing but miles and miles, and now you're going slow. But I like driving across Kansas, I really do. I think it's beautiful. October 24th, 1972, Jackie Robinson dies. Jackie Robinson, who broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball. One very strong man. And I'm not talking about his physical strength where he could bench press whatever. I'm talking about the strength from within to be able to do what he did and see it through. Really admire that. November 7th, 1972. Richard Nixon was re-elected. He defeated George McGovern in the presidential elections. December 7th, 1972, Apollo 17 takes off for the moon, and to date, It's the last manned mission to the moon. April 8th, 1974. Hank Aaron breaks Babe Ruth's all-time home run record. He hit number 715. Hank Aaron rounding the bases after beating Babe Ruth's home run record. August 9, 1974. Richard Nixon resigns from office. After the Watergate scandal, Gerald Ford became our president. April 4th, 1975. Bill Gates and Paul Allen founded Microsoft. It'll be a year or two later before Windows comes out. April 30th, 1975. With the fall of Saigon, the Vietnam War finally ends. June 20th, 1975. Da 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 da. The movie Jaws released. Remember that opening scene? A girl out in the ocean swimming, having fun, and all of a sudden that shark takes a bite out of her. She should have got an Academy Award for acting for that one scene. My brother Don and I went to Denver and sat in Cinerama and watched that movie. And there's one part where that shark jumps at the boat, and we both about jumped out of our seat. I think Don actually screamed a little. I'm sure I didn't. April 1st, 1976. Apple starts. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. November 2nd, 1976. Jimmy Carter defeats Gerald Ford to become the 39th President of the United States. January 1977. The Commodore PET, P-E-T, was first introduced at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show. It is the very first home computer, the Commodore PET. Does anybody remember that? May 25th, 1977. May the Force be with you. Star Wars was introduced, became the highest grossing film ever until E.T. came along. August 16th, 1977. Elvis Presley dies. They say it was from an enlarged heart. We all know that the drugs didn't help. Have you ever been to Graceland? I encourage you going. We went and spent a good part of one day there. Across the main street from the mansion is a huge building, which is a museum and has a couple of Elvis's airplanes out in the parking lot. And that's all fascinating, and car collection, all that. But once you get into the mansion and go through where the man lived and go outside in the grounds and come upon his grave, that you realize that you were glad that you visited Graceland. September 11th, 1977. The Atari 2600 is the first successful home video gaming system. It was released. April 19th, 1978. The U.S. Senate votes to turn over the Panama Canal on December 31st, 1999. March 28th, 1979. The 3 Mile Island accident. 2 million people were exposed to radiation. November 4th, 1979. The Iran hostage crisis began. 52 Americans were held for 444 days. December 21st, 1979. Chrysler receives government loan guarantees. Old Lee Iacocca rescued the company. It was fast falling into bankruptcy, and Iacocca pulled off a huge deal. I, for one, am glad they did. I don't know where the brand Jeep would be without Chrysler. My wife's favorite car was her Jeep Grand Cherokee, and I have a pickup that's a Dodge Ram right now, and I really like that truck. So thank you, Mr. Iacocca. I hope you paid back your loan. And to end the decade of the 70s on a lighter note, I hope you remember this guy. December 26, 1979, Chris Daughtry was born. He is a season 4 or season 5 American Idol contestant that as soon as he was voted out of the contest. RCA Records signed him to a record deal. He has the band Daughtry, and I believe they're pretty good. The 70s brought about a lot of things in our lives. It was the decade that I got married, had my first child, bought my first house. It is also a time when the country just seemed to have been torn apart by the Vietnam War. There's great unrest. And even though everyone is saying peace, love, I think the peace, love movement was a byproduct of the Vietnam War, actually. So here we are in 2020, 50 years removed from 1970. I don't want to forget history. I want to remember it. I don't want to repeat history. And really, through all the stuff that happened, all the bad things, all the people dying, and all the terrible stuff that happened, there's some great stuff in there. If old Steve Jobs wouldn't have started his little company, I probably wouldn't even have a phone in my pocket today. 3 things that seems to be kind of important with the way we live and the way we are. For some reason, I'm not really sure why, but it seems to resonate with all of us, is TV, movies, and music. So let's review all 3 of those for the 1970s. Let's start with television. I want to go over the number 1 show of the television season for each season in the 70s. Season of 1970 through 71, the number 1 show was Marcus Welby, MD. The seasons 1971 through 72, on through the 75 through 76 seasons, 5 seasons in a row. Number 1 show was All in the Family. The 1976-77 season was Happy Days. 1977 through 78 and the 1978 through 79 television seasons, the number 1 show was Laverne and Shirley, which was a spin-off of Happy Days. And the last season of the decade, the 1979 through 1980 television season, the number 1 show was 60 Minutes. I believe Dan Rather was in that back then, but I'm not sure. In movies, the number 1 movie of the decade of the 70s, the number 1 movie released in 1977 was Star Wars Episode 4, which is really Episode 1. It would have stayed Episode 1 if they wouldn't have been such a big hit, and they did prequels and sequels, and they're still doing them. Number 1 movie. Number 2, released in 1975, was Jaws. The number 3 movie, released in 1973, The Exorcist. Number 4, released in 1978, was Grease. The number 5 movie, released in 1977, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The number 6 movie, released in 1978, You Could Really Believe a Man Could Fly, Superman. Number 7, released in 1977, Smokey and the Bandit. The number 8 movie of the decade, released in 1972, The Godfather. The number 9 movie, released in 1977, Saturday Night Fever. And the number 10 movie of the 1970s, released in 1976, Rocky. There's some pretty good movies in there. And the last thing we want to go over is music. And I'm going to give you a list of the top selling albums for each year of the decade of the 70s. 1970, Simon & Garfunkel's Bridge Over Troubled Water. 1971, with various artists, Jesus Christ Superstar. 1972, Neil Young, Harvest. 1973, War, The World is a Ghetto. 1974, Elton John, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. 1975, Elton John. Elton John's Greatest Hits. 1976, Peter Frampton, Frampton Comes Alive. 1977, Fleetwood Mac, Rumors. 1978, The Bee Gees, the soundtrack to Saturday Night Fever. 1979, Billy Joel, 52nd Street. Well, that about wraps up the decade of the 70s. Thank you for going back with me for a little while. Kindness is something that you have a choice of acting on. Like everything in life, kindness is just a choice. Let's have a great 2020. I'll be back next Wednesday.